Good morning, folks, and thanks for joining us. I know we're getting staggered arrivals here, so excited to see friends from around the country, folks we're getting to know, and some we're deep in conversation with here at the Wilson Institute. Excited to welcome you to our first Place Matters webinar on funding, fiscal transparency, and racial equity. Hailing Price of the William Julius Wilson Institute here at HCZ, Harlem Children's Zone, and we're really excited to be offering this webinar in partnership with our friends at Results for America and Blue Meridian Partners. Today, we're also going to be in conversation with local leaders from Salt Lake City to talk through this concept of funding, fiscal transparency, and racial equity in practice. So it's a special time, as many of us in the field know. The American Rescue Plan is going to be infusing $1.9 trillion into the economy through the government and social sector organizations. And beyond existing funding streams that will be leveraged, we're also looking at a lot of interventions that will be targeting the disparate impact on COVID in our communities. This is going to position a lot of local governments and social sector organizations to really be on the tip of the spear as it relates to COVID recovery and response. So we want to think about how that's going to unfold in practice. And today, we're going to begin a conversation about what it might look like to leverage these resources and how to shift structures within the community to ensure these dollars are being used equitably. So really excited to have a live case that we can learn more about and hopefully engage in interactively as the session closes. And before we dive into that, and I pass it to my colleague Laurel from Blue Meridian, just wanted to share a bit about our vantage point. So as most folks on the line know, the Wilson Institute right now is in the process of assessing TA needs and thinking about how we may offer catalytic supports to communities across the Place Matters network. And one thing we're hearing is that COVID recovery is obviously a huge priority and will continue to be. We also know through the conversations that both we and Results for America are leading, that the question of how to effectively partner with local government, how to leverage data, how to do so in support of equitable outcomes is really top of mind for folks. So although there are a few sort of best practices floating around, we think it's going to be really instructive to offer a deep dive on the topic, especially as we think about sustainability for this work during the period of this massive fund dispersal and beyond. So we hope you'll be listening closely and be prepared to engage in a robust conversation about what this will look like going forward. And with that, I'd like to pass it to my colleague, Laurel from Blue Meridian.
Hi, thanks, Hailing. Laura Blatchford. I'm on the Blue Meridian team, Place Matters team, and one of the managing directors for Catalytic support. So just wanted to echo Hailing's thanks. This is really exciting that we've been able to, I hope, support both an opportunistic conversation in the sense that this is a moment that we're in that we all want to think about carefully, but also hopefully a long-term investment in strategy, right? And really, and good work together. I also just want to mention, this is a bit of an experiment in the sense that we're trying webinars. And so Hailing, I see you nodding, like, just give us feedback, let us know how this goes, what we need to tweak collectively, not just me, but the whole team. I think we're very eager to be in dynamic conversation with you, despite our COVID constraints of all being on Zoom and being super busy, to know just that we can all collectively try to learn together to these challenges and opportunities in this environment. The only last thing I want to say is that we have here our Place Matters investees from a range of not only places, but also a policy working group that PolicyLink and the Urban Institute are leading to bring together lots of voices around the formation of policy. Just want to welcome different members of our extended Place Matters family into this conversation. So thank you for joining. And last but not least, as Hailing said, the Institute is at the center of this work, and RFA is a key partner as well. So please direct their questions to them, and I hope this will lead to a more robust set of learnings and conversations about this body of work moving forward. So thank you all for joining today. With that, I'll turn it to Kate Trombo, our partner at Results for America.
Thank you, Laurel. Good morning, everyone. I am Kate Trombo. I'm the Vice President for Federal Policy at Results for America. And I am gonna try and share my screen here and talk a little bit today about the funding that exists in the American Rescue Plan. Okay, so I think that should do it. Great. So there is a lot, as I'm sure you all know, in this bill. And as a result, it's too much to cover in the 10 minutes that I've been allotted today. So I think what I've decided to do, I have some key takeaways that I'm going to try and talk through. I have a set of slides that go much deeper into what's actually in the bill that we will share with you by the end of the day. And in those slides will be my email. I'm happy to answer questions going forward if we don't address them today. I recognize there's just so much that there's no way in like 10 minutes I can cover it, and I don't want to not answer any questions that folks might have. Also, we're just at the beginning of this process, right? The bill just passed. Almost every agency that's going to distribute dollars is going to put out some kind of guidance about those dollars, and they haven't done that yet. So answers are going to kind of keep rolling in. Hence, let's think of this as the beginning of a conversation as opposed to the end. Okay. That being said, let's jump in. In this bill, there are $350 billion for states and local governments, right? So Treasury is going to put out regulations about what those dollars can be used for, the fiscal stabilization dollars, because they're different than they were in the CARES Act. In the CARES Act, you couldn't use them for lost revenue, and here you can. And additionally, the other uses are fairly flexible, just responding to COVID and its negative economic impacts. And then there's $10 billion in critical infrastructure. So that's all fairly different from before. So they'll need some, guidance, and we expect that probably we'll get that in the next month. Child tax credit, it's going to increase to $3,000. The advantage of that, I mean, it's huge, right? But that interacting with some of the other pieces in this bill are going to make deep cuts in the child poverty rate, which is huge, right? So we're expecting based on calculations by Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, about a 40% reduction in the child poverty, lifting about 4 million children out of poverty and about 1.1 million children out of deep poverty. So that's half children living below half the poverty level. $1,400 checks, those are already coming out. There's not a lag on that, but there is not going to be, as everyone probably knows at this point, no increase to the minimum wage. There was an effort to move it up to $15 an hour, but that failed in the Senate. However, there is an expansion of unemployment benefits that will go until September 6th. I'm going to come back to that in relation to the state and local funds in just a minute. In childcare, there's a $24 billion in the childcare expansion, and that eligibility. What's important about that? It's not just for folks who receive Child Care Development Block Grant vouchers at the moment. Also eligible are child care providers who are licensed in the state, even if they're not getting vouchers. So there's an expansion of who can receive the stabilization funds. And then there's also $150 million in home visiting dollars in here. And what's nice about the home visiting dollars, if you are doing home visiting, is it is connected to flexibilities that some of the programs like Nurse Family Partnership have been asking for in terms of being able to do telehealth or email conversations with families, noting that it's been harder to be in person, and in ways that they still can use their funds to be doing visits, some kind of contact with the families. Beyond that, those dollars are also eligible to use for emergency supplies for families, so diapers, formula, even grocery cards. So, and there's a mandate to sort of better organize them, to coordinate with diaper banks. So I think that it's not a ton of money, but it is a nice trying to create some flexibility and address the moment in how we're doing home visiting. Ton of money in K-12, $123 billion. That's going to go to states and LEAs. 90% of the dollars the states receive has to go down to the school districts. So if you're working in K-12, dollars are going to be coming to your school district primarily. There are set-asides in both the state dollars and the school district dollars for evidence-based responses to learning loss. The state also has to set aside some dollars for after school and for extended learning and technology. But what's interesting now, and all of those have evidence-based requirements, but what's really interesting about that is that the set-asides have to be evidence-based using the ESSA evidence standard. So, there are 4 levels. So it doesn't have to be the highest level of evidence. It can be the sort of developing levels of evidence are acceptable there. But the 80% dollars that the school district is going to get, those dollars could also be used for evidence-based interventions. And I mention that because if you are engaged in tutoring, there is a lot of evidence about what works best in tutoring. And so hopefully some of those programs, some of that you're likely engaged in, are going to be funded whether or not they're in the set aside. But it also leaves a lot of room for school districts to innovate and meet the moment and try and identify what are the things, particularly at their local level, are needed to address the needs of their students. Super important point, those learning loss components, those set asides, they have to address academic needs of students, but also social and emotional needs. It's not meant to be a one or the other. The statute actually requires all 3 to be addressed. So that's important. And for community organizations working in this field, you probably recognize how important that is to meet the students where they are at the moment. Okay, a couple other pieces, and then I'm going to go back to sort of some cross-connecting themes that we're seeing. There's 27 billion in emergency rental assistance and 5 billion for homelessness. Tagging back to the ed piece, there's also dollars in the education fund for support for homeless students, and that is separate from the dollars that exist in the homelessness assistance. So there is a lot of money in here to work with students and families who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. There's also money for housing counseling, and 40% of that money, although the housing counseling money is supposed to go out through NeighborWorks, 40% of those dollars are to go to organizations, community organizations that are working with minority or low income families and individuals. Small business, there is a variety of places. There are programs within the Small Business Administration, and then there's one new program in Treasury. Within the Small Business Administration, there's 175 million for community navigators. Those are dollars to go to nonprofits to help small businesses, particularly minority owned and businesses owned within low-income communities, access the Small Business Administration's resources. So that's a new, it hasn't existed before, and it's going to be, I think, important for community organizations to really help get the word out and ensure that the right dollars are going into the right communities. The Paycheck Protection Program did get some more funding, but it changed a few of the eligibility requirements for really big nonprofits. So if you were a nationwide nonprofit and because you had more than 500 employees and you didn't meet some of the previous exemptions, you are actually now eligible for a paycheck protection if you have less than 500 employees at each of your locations across the country. But it didn't otherwise change the Paycheck Protection Program. Dollars in here are for restaurants in particular, and the interesting piece about here is there's actually a 20-day sort of preference period for women, veterans, and what the bill calls socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. These dollars include restaurants, bars, and food trucks, among others, but it's nice to have that sort of period recognizing that the Small Business Administration has not in the past gotten dollars out to the most affected communities well, so they've created a period where it has to preference them. Okay, there's a big expansion of home and community-based services, about 12.7 billion, and 50 million for community organizations providing behavioral health services. So like the navigators under small business, there's a carve out specifically for community organizations to help do this work. And then lastly, there are actually some great provisions for rural in the housing, homeowners assistance and rental housing in hospitals and in homelessness as well. So they're actually carve outs. There usually are in a bill, but there seem to be a good number of them here. Okay, it's a really quick run through of what's dollars wise in there. Recognizing I'm running out of time, I just want to step back and then I'll answer a couple questions. Couple things to note. This is, as you've seen by these numbers, this is a lot of money, right? $5 trillion since the beginning of all of this, since back in 2020, that the federal government has put out to to address COVID response. It's all one-time dollars, so it's not going to be there to sustain once it's spent. So I think for community organizations thinking about working with their local government to use these dollars well, think about the fact that these aren't, once they're gone, right? We're not coming back. So if you're paying salaries with it, if you're doing things like that that are ongoing costs, you could hit a funding cliff. So I think it will be important to think about how can you help your local government? How can you push your local government to use these dollars in a way that they're going to help now, help effectively, and that the things that they're going to do will have impact even when the dollars go away. So that might be things like budgeting for equity, right? In the state and fiscal stabilization dollars, Treasury is going to put out guidance as to how those dollars can be used. We are going to ask them, I think others are as well, to ensure, clarify that some of the dollars that the cities, and particularly the cities, get around providing government services, responding to COVID, that those be allowed to be used for things like planning, research, capacity building, data, which would allow a city government and a community to engage around a project, around an equitable budgeting initiative, right? Thinking about not just are we getting the dollars out, but how are we getting them out? How are we changing the process by which the cities do their budget and their fiscal planning such that we are centering equity? That is not an immediate necessarily response to COVID. It is, but it's also got much longer sustainable impact. So being part of that conversation with your city, or particularly your city government or your county government, it could be important. And we think that the dollars here could be used for that kind of a project. Because there's so many dollars, they're going to have to go out to trusted partners. People on this call are trusted partners. So if you're trusted partners and you're doing after school, you're doing summer, you're doing tutoring, please be in conversation now with your school districts, because although there's a little bit of lag before the dollars come out, we know that states are asking for school districts to put in their budgets and their summer plans now, even though they don't necessarily have their ARP dollars yet. So there's a lot of funding. It's got to be used well, and it's going to trusted partners will help it do that. Okay, last thing on cross-cutting. There are, again, lots of dollars, but dollars for some of it's going into state and local, right? You saw that large chunk, and those can be used for COVID response, but then the things are going into silos like education or homelessness or into healthcare, into small business. And so thinking about how is the city spending their fiscal relief dollars in combination with how the school district is spending theirs, or how is the city spending its infrastructure dollars on broadband and sewer that complement rather than duplicate the dollars that are going to go through the E-rate program, about 7.1 billion of them, for emerging connectivity, right? So there are different parts in the bill where funding is for the same thing, just to different people. So I think keeping an eye on those connectivities is going to be important. All right, I am a little beyond, so I want to look at a couple questions before I jump off. Are there community navigator grants for government agencies or nonprofits helping people in poverty get connected to education and health services? There are a lot of education dollars that can be used very flexibly. Basically, if you're allowed to do it under ESSA, you're allowed to do it with these dollars. So I would say, yes, they're not specific community navigator dollars, but for certain, a school district could spend its dollars to help people get connected to education services. There are navigator dollars in the homelessness, and there are, I think, I have to come back to, I believe there are a few in the health services, but not as specific. But the education stuff is there. Emergency rental assistance, is there a mandate that this is direct to landlord or tenant? There are housing voucher dollars, yes, but there are also in the homelessness assistance pieces, there are rental assistance to states and local governments that are not direct to landlord or tenant, but there are also Section 8 vouchers. I'm hoping that answers the question. Is there anything specific in the K-12 allocation for the early grades? No, it's just to the school district. There's not a separate carve out that X dollars go just to K-3, although hopefully given the drop-offs we're seeing in preschool enrollment in the last year, school districts are going to really put some dollars towards their early grades, given we know it's going to take a number of years to overcome the loss that we've seen in the 3- and 4-year-olds just in this last year. But nothing says it has to go specifically to early grades. If local governments and school districts provide one-time funding to support intermediaries, would those funds received need to be expended within the same time frame from the recipient? It depends, Russell, it depends on where you're getting the dollars from. In education, there is a requirement that the dollars be spent by the end of September 2023. And some of the others, there is a similar requirement that things be spent within that time. I believe that would transfer over to intermediaries. Most of the deadlines are 2023 or 2024. So there is a decent period of time for spending the dollars down. So we think in terms of guidance, Treasury will be have to get their funds out within 60 days. Our anticipation is that guidance will come out probably within a month from some of the key agencies, Treasury, Education, HUD, and SBA in particular. After CARES, SBA did actually get guidance out pretty quickly. You'll remember it was like on this weird rolling basis. It wasn't always the most easy to access, but they did get the initial set out quickly, and we anticipate that will happen here again. Grants for summer slide. So 60 days. Once the state gets the dollars, we anticipate ED will get them out as fast as they can. It seems like 60 days. It's a little questionable how long ED has to get it out. But as soon as the state gets it, the state only has 60 days to get it to the school district. So we think that those dollars will start coming, and everyone in the process of ED is aware that dollars need to go to the districts now, because obviously we're in the middle of March, and the school year ends in June, May, some places here in the South, and they need to start covering. So you're probably looking at, like, I'd say 60 to 90 days when dollars will be in the school district, and the school district then has a year to get those dollars out, to use those dollars to distribute them. Okay, medium size, there's little capacity to figure out how to prioritize. Yes, so Laura, whoever asked that, that's a brilliant question. Yes, many small districts and middle-sized districts are going to have trouble using these dollars. It's a lot of money for them to get out, and this is a perfect place where groups within this community can be in conversation and helping, that we could make some suggestions about how to use those dollars. I would argue that some of the ways we suggest using them are not just for one-time the expenditures now. They do need to make those PPE, after-school learning, tutoring, but also for things that change the systematic way they do government. Like I mentioned, the budgeting for equity, putting some money into data and disaggregating data and looking at the choices they make. Okay, I probably need to go because I have run over our time. I will try and answer in the chat the last couple questions here. And then my email, like I said, is going to be at the end of these slides, and I will happily answer any other big or little questions you have once you have a chance to dig into them about the funding that exists. In the meantime, I will turn it over to Nicole Dunn and her panel to talk about how this kind of community government partnership might look.
Thanks, Kate. Hello, I'm Nicole Dunn. I'm a senior advisor with Results for America, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're about to have on funding, fiscal transparency, and a racial equity governing agenda. So first, let me introduce our panelists. We can ask our panelists to turn their cameras on and join us. Hello. Hello. First, we have Alicia Garnier, is the Executive Vice President at PolicyLink, where she guides the development and execution of programs to ensure that the 100 million people in America living in or near poverty, particularly those who face the burdens of structural racism, can participate in a just society, live in a healthy community of opportunity, and prosper in an equitable economy. Welcome, Alicia. Mayor Erin Mendenhall, welcome. Mayor Mendenhall is the 36th mayor of Salt Lake City. Prior to serving as mayor, Aaron worked to advance air quality policy, both as a nonprofit leader and on the city council. As mayor, Aaron is working hard to make Salt Lake City more environmentally and economically resilient. She is determined to ensure every Salt Laker, no matter their neighborhood, economic or housing status, faith, race, or sexual or gender identity, can access all the city has to offer. Bill Krim is the president and CEO for the United Way of Salt Lake. He has worked for 30 years on issues related to economic opportunity, healthcare, education, and poverty. Bill has been with the United Way of Salt Lake since 2004, and prior to becoming CEO, led United Way of Salt Lake's community transformation initiatives, developing and supporting collective impact cradle-to-career collaborations in 6 communities, along with statewide public policy advocacy. Okay, welcome everyone. Let's dive into this conversation. I will start with Alicia. PolicyLink was founded on the premise that when wisdom, voice, experience of communities harmed by structural racism drive policymaking, profound policy transformation emerge. What lessons can you share from PolicyLink's 20 years working to advance racial equity in America? And what should we be talking and thinking about as we work to advance economic mobility and equity and community power in local communities?
Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Nicole. I am grateful to be here. I'm Ashley Gardier. I serve as Executive Vice President at PolicyLink. And for those who don't know, we are a national research and action institute that's committed to advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. Essentially, from our founding, we recognize that the solutions to the nation's most intractable problems they exist already, and they're held by the folks who are closest to the problem. And oftentimes the solutions are quite simple. Here's an example for racial equity. So race was constructed, it evolved over time, it shapes American democracy and economy. If we want to achieve racial equity, then it means that we actually have to redesign the nation structures and our local ones to become anti-racist. And so the solution is simple and it's obvious, but what is hard is that it requires a multiracial cross-sector coalition. It requires greater activation and coordination of our people power, and it requires a new way of working. We've got to redesign systems and structures to serve everybody. They were never designed to do that. And I think what we've been experiencing, certainly, well, in our history, I was going to say certainly in my lifetime, that's not long enough, but is that race neutral strategies, the ones that we're accustomed to, mean that every few years we find ourselves in a new place, supporting recovery from a new crisis and achieving limited results. That said, the Biden administration has created a real opportunity for structural redesign, and we at PolicyLink are thrilled that they've invited us into partnership to help realize a few key elements of President Biden's Day One executive order on racial equity. And that's to build new governing standards that center racial equity. It means that we are working with common and uncommon partners. So for example, we're working with McKinsey & Company to conduct a comprehensive racial equity audit of each federal agency's statutes, regulations, and programs to identify policies that by design or effect are anti-Black. We're also working with the Urban Institute to create a new way to score legislation, moving beyond just cost analysis that is typically conducted by the Congressional Budget Office, but to also measure racial equity impacts. And then finally, we're encouraging the administration to strengthen how and what kinds of data the federal government collects. So standardizing methods to disaggregate data that like Kate talked about previously, and creating shared practices for analysis and decision-making that's based on that disaggregated data. All of these strategies within the racial equity governing agenda are innovations that come from the ground. And we're using them to accelerate racial equity at the federal level. And we're excited that the American Rescue Plan is really now starting to model the critical lessons about how federal policy can actually shift toward structural change. The plan centers people and place, both in urban and rural communities that are often left behind. It targets socially and economically disadvantaged groups. The best example in my mind are the resources that are being directed to Black farmers in an effort to repair the harm that's been caused historically by inequitable policies that ultimately stripped ownership from Black farmers. And then finally, which I think sets us up for this conversation, I'm most excited about imagining what's possible in the American Rescue Plan in communities like Salt Lake City that have already started the process of engaging community voice in setting priorities and directing investments in those areas that they know are most important. So I'm just happy to be here and happy to join the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. That's a great transition to ask Mayor Mendenhall, to make government more equitable, leaders must engage the very groups that have historically been left out of shaping our government's institutions. This requires building trust, engaging leaders, and ensuring the public has a voice. How have you worked to build that trust and ensure the public and your community has a voice? And what are the challenges in creating such a shared vision?
Well, Ashley really framed it up beautifully, and I could just give the rest of my time to Ashley to let her keep talking and teaching us. But as she said, and as we all know, the systems of government, systems of institutions across this country were built to serve a portion of our population at a greater advantage than others. And if you don't know Salt Lake City, obviously I'm biased, but it's an incredible place. We're a blue dot in a red state, and in many ways we're a political and cultural kind of pendulum swing from what you might think of the state of Utah. And therefore we act as a magnet. We end up having a very intentional culture that comes together here because we want to live in this community because of its difference and the likeness. Therefore, we have a lot of diversity in Salt Lake City. And yet, when we talk about the systemic changes that we must make, and that I believe city government has an incredibly tangible role in creating, one thing that I've kept on my wall, and Bill probably has seen this before, but since I was a council member, I've kept this historic map of my city that's up at the University of Utah in their archives, this pencil drawn map of Salt Lake City of redlining. And the hazardous areas identified on this map that's from the early 60s are still the predictive of outcomes for our residents today. That's housing access and stability, it's graduation rates, it's obesity rates, it's transportation access, it's access to capital to start a business. You can almost name it, and this map is still predictive for Salt Lake City. Long before I was born, this practice became illegal. But the zoning, the financing, the community voices, the representation, the access to government hasn't changed enough. So since I started in this role of mayor at the beginning of 2020, which was just about 5 years ago now, and my gray hair will show you how long it's been since I started the job, January of last year, we started wanting to address these deep issues. And I think that the opening of 2020 and the movement that's been created since the murder of George Floyd has provided us a more tremendous opportunity to get at these systems than I've ever seen and ever could have predicted before. So how do we go about that? It's about transparency as government, the way that we operate. It's about access. It's about empowerment and partnership. with our communities who have been historically disadvantaged and left out. The transparency comes in the awkward actions that I think are critical, like we put out an annual plan. We put one out in 2020, we put one out just now in January of 2021, and we'll do it every year of my administration. And there's about 60 different acute actions we intend to take to create equity and access to opportunity and environmental resiliency in Salt Lake City. And then we grade ourselves at the end of the year. And we didn't accomplish everything that we set out to in 2020, which in retrospect makes some sense, but we talk about why we didn't, what we're doing next, what we did get done, and where the community can see that impact. We're going to keep doing that because I think that kind of vulnerability as an asset is what underpins the trust that we have to build with communities. Just opening the doors isn't enough. So the access to the conversation means growing the table in the sense of growing our boards and commissions, the representation on them, where they meet. Not that maybe that they're not all meeting here in City Hall like they traditionally have done. They can meet in other parts of our communities, that there's childcare stipends, that there's transit stipends for people to be able to access and participate. We have to rethink the way that we have engaged in what we've thought was enough in the past, that the open doors were simply enough, and it's not. From the transportation to the housing, even the food we provide at our meetings, we have been in a very tight cookie cutter. And so that the reshaping of that metal, so to speak, as Ashley so well said, is the work that we get to do right now. And it should be led by the communities who know the solutions better than we do, which is the kind of political leadership that I'm looking for across this country, at the local level, from community organizations up to our president and our state leaders across this country. I want to hear people say what we thought was okay, we recognize is not good enough. In fact, it might be completely wrong, and we want to work with you to make it right.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Bill, reflecting on that, and how do we, as the mayor was talking about, reshape the metal and really bring people in. For the past decade, United Way of Salt Lake's core work has been the elimination of racial and economic disparity gaps in education and health outcomes. So how is the work you're doing with Salt Lake City to develop a community-wide equitable recovery and economic and social mobility plan, helping to meet this goal and working to reshape that metal, as the mayor was saying?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is our partnership infrastructure is trying to get behind that kind of leadership. So what you just heard Mayor Mendenhall describe is a powerful commitment to equity. It's a powerful commitment to dismantle racism and to rebuild or reimagine or completely remake systems. And the planning process really has been this incredible opportunity to connect that kind of leadership, not only in Salt Lake City, but in other places within the Promise Partnership region, to reinforce that unique vision, that willingness to step into the moment, to do the things that both Kate and Ashley described. We cannot think about this moment and the resources of the American Recovery Act as simply programs. We have to think about this, as has been said, as a moment to reshape and remake and dismantle systems. And there's enormous inertia. I think we just have to acknowledge there is enormous inertia to keep the systems the same, even within all of our partnerships. I think it's easy to not push against the systems. It's easy to not confront the loss, or to not shift the power that needs to be shifted. So what's incredible about this moment, about the kinds of leaders that Mayor Mendenhall is and represents, is that there is a moment to do something big, but we have to be really intent about not letting the inertia to simply focus on the programmatic opportunities take hold. We have to constantly question our practices, constantly question our own behaviors in that, constantly push ourselves for the different ways of working. And this planning process, I think, is structured to help us do that. And so we're grateful to be part of that and to be learning from everybody in this network.
Great, thanks, Bill. Building on that, Ashley, Congress just passed, as we've just been talking about, the American Rescue Act, a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, which Kate outlined. For these resources to land in place equitably, what do local governments and communities have to do?
So first, I want to just shout out one of my longest and dearest colleagues, Judith Dangerfield. She has coined this term, de-exceptionalizing crisis. And while we've been wrestling with this in New Orleans since Hurricane Katrina, I think COVID has absolutely helped us to really get that as long as we continue to decide that each one of these things is a crisis and not see the chronic disaster that poor people and disenfranchised folks are living in every day, we're going to just continue to spin our wheels. And that's one of the reasons, I think, to Mayor Mendenhall's point and Bill's as well, is that community voice and shared power is so critical, because the folks who are living in the daily reality of structural racism, they already know that COVID, nor Hurricane Katrina, nor the Great Recession was the root cause of the struggle that they are experiencing. And quite frankly, absent of race-conscious policies and a razor-sharp focus on delivering equitable outcomes, the recovery efforts are just going to leave communities of color behind, continue to leave frontline communities behind. And so super practically, PolicyLink is preparing guidance for city and county governments to encourage equitable investments of federal funds. So we are working hard to beat the deployment of the rescue resources, but we also want to be ready for the future recovery funding that's coming. I have worked for 2 mayors, and I'm sure that this is not the case for Mayor Mendenhall, but for the 2 that I worked for, mayors don't want to be told what to do, right? And so this guidance is not designed to prescribe, 50% of jobs that result from funding should go to local workers, or 35% of contracts should go to businesses owned by people of color. Number one, because that would miss the local context that exists on the ground. But we do want to offer guiding questions that sit at the decision points that local electeds would be wrestling with. So questions like, does the investment build the capacity of institutions that will remain and strengthen the region? One of the biggest lessons from our Katrina experience is that we really invested billions of dollars into a multinational company to manage our rebuilding process, and that capacity left with them, right? And we don't want to continue to do that. Another example might be, in how we invest our resources, making sure that we're not creating new barriers. So when we're focused on eviction protections, particularly in the South, that those protections don't fly in the face of small-scale landlords who are not rich and wealthy, and whose resources are tied to the property that they own. So more to come around that, but we want to make sure that there are guiding questions to inform those critical decision points. And then just to Bill's piece about inertia, again, as somebody who worked at the local level, whenever we try to really move and advance racial equity, the very first thing would be a legal question, right? It's illegal to center race in policy. And so one of the other things that PolicyLink feels responsible for doing is engaging scholars in constitutional law to start thinking with us about how we can legally begin to center race in policy. It's not just something important at the federal level, but in order for us to do the work at the local level and really be armed to fight preemption at the state, we've got to be able to have those tools in our toolkit as well.
Well, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we only have, 1 minute or so to wrap up. So I'd like to leave the last question for the mayor, and then we're going to jump into breakout rooms to reflect on what we've heard in this great discussion. So, building on what Ashley just talked about what local governments need to do to make sure this funding is used equitably, and thinking about, how you're using the city budgeting for equity and recovery program to expand your ongoing commitment to investing in neighborhoods that have experienced years of disinvestment. How are you thinking about both how you're using your city budgeting and how you're thinking about these stimulus dollars going forward?
Yeah, Ashley, I want to piggyback on something you said around not wanting to change, and Bill's point that there's so much inertia to keep things the same. I thought you were going to say, Bill, that there's so much inertia to change right now, but you're absolutely right. And it's large. I think the inertia to stay the same is larger and it's more insidious than we can even articulate. And so I want to encourage everybody with my last kind of remark here to get intentional about being uncomfortable with what we have relied on as sure for all of our careers. Get intentional about unpacking the echo chamber that your staff meetings might be. Ask to be challenged. Sit through those public hearings like I do night after night with my city council and get our butts chewed. It's important to be there, to listen. Think about mentoring. Reach out to your BIPOC community youth and find some youth to bring into your inner circle. Get to know them. Also, they mentor me more than I mentor them. And when it comes to the budget, for any institution, I love how President Biden often says, don't tell me what you value, show me what you budget, and I'll tell you what you value. And as a city, we're trying now, and very much with the help of the city budgeting initiative and the work that we get to participate in, this equity and recovery program, listening to other cities, because we can't just say we want to know what the best practices are. We're at the tip of an evolving conversation, really, as a nation and as community. So I want to know what these up and coming ideas are. What are these new ways of thinking? And that takes some courage for leadership of organizations and community leaders to be able to say, I know we're doing this differently. Here's why. Here's why we're doing it differently. And so I'm sorry, I'm not exactly answering your question, Nicole, but I know we're out of time, and I just want to encourage us all to get comfortable with the fringes of our comfort level. Otherwise, we're going to miss this opportunity. And coming from a community organizing background, all volunteers burn out, and it's very difficult to continue that momentum of the movement and make it not, I love that, de-exceptionalizing the crisis. Let's de-exceptionalize the momentum we're feeling to support the change right now. And as Salt Lake City's trying to do, move that lens of equity, the focus on equity and resiliency for all of our community members to the hub of our system, to the middle, not as a separate facet of a division of a department or a single person's focus. That structural shift into the center should be happening in all of our organizations, and it's going to be uncomfortable while we go through it. That means you're on the right track.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor Mendenhall, Ashley, and Bill. What a wonderful conversation. So we're going to, I'm now going to turn it over to Kate or Alex to, we're going to jump into breakout rooms and reflect. So thank you again for your time.
Well, thank you, everyone. Haling, I think I'm going to appreciate everyone joining us today. And I know that there was a lot of information, both really thoughtful from Ashley and Mayor Mendenhall and Bill, and a little more sort of thrown at you all at once from me. But we appreciate you digging in with us and walking through some of these initial thoughts around the American Rescue Plan, as well as ways that it offers a springboard or a leverage for real collaboration around equitable uses of revenues and funds and transparency in place. So happy to continue this conversation. I know that the Blue Meridian and the Wilson Institute are going to continue these webinars. So today's the first one. There'll be several more. And also everyone that was presenting, myself, Nicole, Ashley, Bill, Mayor, I'm sure we all be happy to be resources going forward. Hailing, do you have any last words?
Sure, thanks, Kate. Just want to thank you all for joining us. I got to participate in obviously one of the breakouts and thought it was the beginning of what will hopefully be a longer conversation across our team. So as we're learning for the collective learning of the group, I think increased space and time for us to be generative in these conversations will be important too. But I want to thank you all for the thoughtful contributions again. Remind you all that our team at the Wilson Institute, the Blue Meridian team, and OA, others are here at your service as we're continuing to learn about this work together. And I will preview that in late April, we're looking to host a follow-up conversation about how to leverage the federal stimulus specifically for equitable recovery into our schools. So we'll have an educator-focused conversation that'll be a deeper dive on strategies and what we're learning around the country and resources for you all to plug in on those strategies going forward. So thank you all for the great time and informative conversation today. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversation with you all soon. Take good care.